Hello everyone and welcome to .NET Core Central. In today's video, I am going to cover JavaScript Interop for Blazor. From Blazor WebAssembly, we can call JavaScript function, and from JavaScript functions also we can call C# code in Blazor WebAssembly. This feature is very important because there are a lot of JavaScript utility framework out there which does a lot of feature which not necessarily might be available in C#. So having this feature helps us to use the vast variety of JavaScript framework out there from the C# code. So we would be able to call functions which are residing on JavaScript from C# code. So to demonstrate this, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new JavaScript file inside of www.root. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new item, and for the file I'm going to select a JavaScript file and I'm going to name it as main.js. Once the file is created, I'm going to go into index.html, and in index.html I'm going to add a reference to the JavaScript file. So the reference is added, and next thing, let's start with a very simple JavaScript function that we want to call from the C# code. So there are two types of functions that we can call. One is a function without any return, which is a void function, and another one is with return, and in both cases we can either take parameter or we might not take parameter. So first let's start with a simple function. So for that I am going to create an iffy, and iffy is an immediate invocable function in JavaScript. So it goes something like this. So the function will be immediately invoked, and here I'm not going to worry about the namespace collision. So I'm just going to, because I know for sure I don't have anything else, but I'm going to take precaution that if a function already exists, I'm not going to override it. So I'm just going to do So here I have a very simple function. It's a void function. It takes a counter value and then just logs the value. So it does console.log printing from JavaScript counter. That's all. Very simple. Doesn't return anything. It's a void function. So that's the one we're going to try out first. The goal is to print this counter in this JavaScript function. So for that, instead of writing code inside of this code behind, I'm going to create a new class and I'm going to name it as .NET to JavaScript. It is not a good name, but it's a very clear name, at least for this example. And now I want to call the function, but for calling a JavaScript function from C#, we need a particular type, which is IJS runtime. So I'm going to inject the IJS runtime into the constructor of this class. And the IJS runtime is part of Microsoft.js Interop namespace. I'm going to add it. And then I'm going to have a public method which can be invoked by the code behind to call the JavaScript function. So for the public method, I'm going to have, and I'm going to keep it as void. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke the JavaScript function. So how do I do that? I'm going to use IJS runtime dot, I'm going to call the invoke void async, because at this point in time I'm just invoking a void method. So I'm going to make a call to invoke void async, and here I'm going to pass the name of the JavaScript function. Now given that my JavaScript function is added to the window itself, I can just use log user. That's my function name, and it takes array of arguments which is passed as param. So I'm going to pass the counter to it. That's all I have to do. Once I do that, from C#, it is going to invoke the JavaScript function, this particular function, and it will do this console.log. So it will log into the console of the browser. Now next thing what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into counter.razor.cs, and here I'm going to add this class as a dependency, but for that let me just extract an interface, and then instead of the class let's add the interface as a dependency. So we can say private So we add the inject attribute, which will inject this interface into this class. And then here, after we print out the counter from the C# code, we can say .NET to JavaScript dot print. And here we can pass out the current count. And given this is an async method, I'm going to add await. And here I'm going to change it to async task. So this should do it. In the .NET to JavaScript, we just added the IJS runtime, and using IJS runtime, we are calling invoke void async method, where we are passing the function name and the parameter to call the JavaScript function, which is this function here, log user, and the parameter is a counter, and that is going to print it. To keep the naming convention, I'm just going to rename print as print async. The last thing that I have to do is in the program, I'll have to add the dependency for the new class that I created. So I'm going to add scoped, and it is going to be .NET to JavaScript, which goes to .NET to JavaScript class. That's about it. And now I'm going to run this application, and once the browser shows up, I'm going to open up the developer tool so that I can see the console. And then I'm going to go into the counter. And then when I increment the counter, you can see it is current count from C#, and then it is printing in JavaScript counter 1. So I am able to, and you can see this is coming from the main.js. And if I put a breakpoint here and do a click me, you can see it is showing up here in the JavaScript class. So that's how you can call a JavaScript from the C#. But right now, the JavaScript function that we have, it is just calling a function which does not return anything. So we can create a function which returns something, and that is something we can use from the C#. So let's do that. Let's say window dot, and this time let's say get formatted message, and we're going to do like previously. We're going to say if this is equal to window dot get formatted message or function, and this time we will not keep any parameter, though you can give the parameter. It works same way, but I'm just not going to give any parameter. And here we're just going to have a return, and we can say hello from JavaScript to C#. This looks like a nice enough message. And then what we can do is we can go back to the i.NET JavaScript, and here we can create another function, and we can say print formatted message. That's about it. And then we can go into the class and implement the missing method. And here we can do the same thing. We can use await and IJS runtime dot, and this time instead of invoke void async, we are going to use invoke async, and here we are going to pass string because the return type is string. And then for the function name, we are going to give this get formatted message. That's the method. And here we can say var message is equal to await of get formatted message. This has to be async. And then finally, this time let's use the ilogger. So you can say ilogger, and here we can say logger dot log information, and we can just log the message that is coming in. So if we do that, we have this new function now, get formatted message, which just returns a string. Remember, this is not doing a console log, this is just returning a string. And then in the .NET to JavaScript, we added a new method called print formatted message, where we are invoking the function get formatted message and providing the type as string for return type. We're getting the message and then logging the information using iLogger. And then I'm going to go into counter, and here I'm going to call the other method also. So I'm going to call it .NET to JavaScript dot print formatted message. That's it. And then I'm going to run this application, and just like before, I'm going to go to more tools and add the developer tool here so that I can look into the console. Then I'm going to go into counter, and now if I click on click me, it comes here. I'm going to remove this breakpoint, go back to console, and you can see here current count 1, printing in JavaScript counter 1, and then now it is logging the info that I added, and it's saying hello from JavaScript to C#. Again, current count 2, printing in JavaScript counter 2, and the hello from JavaScript to C#. So this is working as expected. So this shows how we can call JavaScript functions from C#, and the function can have a return, or it might not have return. It can take parameter, or it might not take parameter. So this is extremely handy, and in my opinion can be really useful in cases where there are functions or frameworks in JavaScript which are really easily available and can be used from a C# code to call back. So that's the first part of the video I wanted to cover. The next part is calling a C# code from JavaScript. Now there are two ways of doing that. The first way of calling C# from JavaScript code is pretty straightforward. It is the case where a function is a static function. But if you want to call an instance function from JavaScript, that is not very straightforward. So first I'm going to cover the static function use case. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function in the counter.blazor.cs itself. So I can create a function called private, and it has to be static, and then task string, and let's say help message. This is a help message which is coming from configuration or something. But for the time being, I'm not going to use configuration, just going to use hard-coded message, and I'm going to do a return. And here I'm going to say help text from C# static function. This is the static function, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use an attribute here which will say JS invocable, and JS invocable is part of Microsoft.interop namespace. So let's do that. This is going to make this function, this static function, available to JavaScript. Now one thing to remember is the function name for any static function has to be unique across the solution. So if you have a help message here which is JS invocable, and you provide another help message in another class and give that also JS invocable, you're going to get an error saying there's a conflict. Because, and why it is so, once we call it from here, it will become clear, because the way it is called is, it is called without any type name. So now I'm going to do window dot invoke .NET static function. So that's the name of my method, and just like before, I'm going to do window dot invoke or function. And here for invoking a .NET function, there is already a type which is available as a part of the Blazor JS, and it is called .NET, and we can do .NET dot invoke method async, and here there are a couple of things goes. First thing is the name of the namespace, which is Blazor.demo in our case, and next thing is the name of the function, and the function name is help message. So I'm just going to give that, and then you can give an array of parameters. In my case, I don't have any, so I'm just going to leave it empty, and then you can do dot then, so it's going to get a callback, and you can do data goes to, and I'm just going to do console dot log data. That's all. I have to close this. Okay. Now if I run this application, we should be getting this help test from C# static function should be coming into this method, this JavaScript function, and should be printed. But for that, we want to invoke this function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into counter.razor, and I'm just going to create a new button here. So I'm just going to copy paste this, and I'm going to say static method, and here what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide the name of the function, which is invoke.net static function, and this is the name of the JavaScript function. Since it is added to the Windows, I can just use it as is, and here it's not going to be @onClick anymore because it is a JavaScript function, so it's just going to be on click, and it'll be this. So that's all I have to do. And now let me run this function. The reason I got rid of because this is a pure JavaScript call and not a Blazor WebAssembly on click function. Now if I open up the developer tool here, go to counter, and now if I click on this invoke static method, I made a mistake. Here it has to be public. So let me run again, and once the UI shows up, I'm going to open up the developer tool, and then we'll go to counter and click on invoke static method, and you can see here help test from C# static function is been printed. If I go to main.js, this is getting called, and then in the callback we are logging this text message. So this is pretty simple. The only thing to keep in mind is the function has to be public static, and if it is having a JS invocable, you cannot use the same function name anywhere in the class with JS invocable attribute, because that would create a collision and you cannot do that. But otherwise it's pretty straightforward. Now I'm not 100% sure how useful it is going to be. Maybe in some complex cases we might need to call C# from JavaScript, but most of the time I think we will be calling JavaScript from C#. Now let's look into how do we call an instance method. That's a little bit complex. First I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to name it as address provider, and this class needs to implement iDisposable, and I'm going to explain why in a few. So first let's start and let's create a method, and let's say public string get address, and here I'm just going to return 1 to 3 Main Street, and this function we want to make it as JS invocable. This is the instance function, but as I mentioned, we cannot call it directly, so we have to do some things before. So what we have to do, so the way it works is we first call a JavaScript function from here which will register this class or this instance into JavaScript, and then we can use the instance in the JavaScript to call back any other method which is JS invocable in this class. So first we have to create a register function. So I'm going to create a public async task register, and then what I'm going to do is inside of the register function I need to create a reference of this class using .NET object reference type provided by the framework. So for that I'll create private .NET reference, and for .NET reference the type it is going to create is address provider, and I'm going to name it as object reference for the time being. And then I also need IJS runtime, because as I mentioned I have to call the JavaScript first to register this object reference in the JavaScript so that we can call back into the JS invocable function of this instance. Again, it's a little bit complex, but let's go through it. We create a constructor, and here I'm going to inject IJS runtime, and I'm going to initialize this field, and then in the register what I'm going to do is I'm going to say object reference is equal to .NET object reference dot create, and in this case we are going to create this current object. That's what we are creating. And then now we are going to call await JS runtime dot invoke void async, and here we are going to call a function which is going to register the object reference in the JavaScript. So I don't know the function yet because we have not created it yet. So let's go here and create the function. So I am going to name it as invoke.net instance function. So for that, what we can do is we can do window.invoke.net instance function, and we can do equal to window dot function, or going to have function, and here this one is going to take the .NET instance as reference, and I'm just going to name it as address provider. That's the name of the instance. And then here we can use address provider dot invoke method async, and here we can provide the name of the method, which is get address in this case. So get address, and then we are going to say dot then, and the response comes back. We're just going to do console.log data. That's all we are going to do. So as you can see, register it. While registration, we pass the instance, and then with the instance, we can do a callback into the actual instance method. So now we can use this function down here as the name of the function we are going to call. And then what we can do is, now we want to access this, but before we do that, let me add that into the service registry. Address provider. And next what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to counter.trezor, and here I'm going to create another button, and this is going to be invoke instance method, and here I'm going to have call instance method. This method doesn't exist yet, so I should be getting a red squiggly. I'm going to go into counter.result.cs, and here I am going to create this method. So I can say private async task create. Now the red squiggly should go away, and now I need the address here, address provider, so I can create private address provider get set, and I'm going to use the inject attribute to inject this, and here I'm going to do await address provider dot register. That's about it. And one thing I missed in the address provider is that in the dispose, I'm going to dispose of the object reference. So object reference dot dispose. This needs to be disposed of, so I'm just going to dispose it off here. Now if I run this function, and when I click this button, what's going to happen is it's going to call this, which is going to register, call the register. The register is going to create the instance using the current instance in the .NET object reference wrapper, and then it is going to call this function to pass the object reference, and in the function we are getting it, and then we are immediately invoking the instance method here. Now this is not that useful in a real life scenario. Once we get the object, we are just going to set it to a local variable, and then we can use it in a different occasion. But I'm just showing this for simplicity, at least so that you understand the concept and you understand how it is being used. So let me run this now, and once the UI is up, I am going to open up the developer tool, and I'm going to go into counter, and this time I'm going to call the invoke instance method. And if I call it, you can see in the main.js, it is coming back here and printing the data which is coming from C# instance method, which is 123 Main Street. This is the data we send from the address provider, this instance method. So these are the two very important concepts of JavaScript interop in Blazor WebAssembly. One is calling JavaScript method from C# and the other one is calling C# method from JavaScript. And that is all I wanted to cover today. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you are new to my channel and you think you are getting value out of my channel, please subscribe to my channel. And thanks so much for watching this video.